Ellis Island wasn't just a gateway to America, it was a test of survival. Millions of immigrants arrived with empty pockets but full hearts, carrying only the recipes of their homelands. Built in 1892 at the mouth of New York Harbor, Ellis Island became the nation's busiest immigration station, where hopeful families queued for hours under the Statue of Liberty's shadow. They came from Ireland and Italy, Germany and Poland, Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe, and later from Greece, the Balkans and Scandinavia, each bringing their own food traditions to American shores. These 25 forgotten dishes aren't just meals, they're stories of hope, grit, and the flavors that built America. And once you see how they survived, you'll never look at your dinner plate the same way again. 1. Buckwheat Kasha with caramelized onions. For many Eastern European immigrants, survival in America began with a pot of kasha, buckwheat groats, boiled until soft, then topped with onions fried in lard or goose fat. It wasn't fancy, but it filled bellies. In crowded tenements, 1 cup of grain stretched to feed an entire family. Fathers carried it in lunch tins to the docks, children ate it before school, and mothers stirred it with whatever scraps they could find. What made kasha powerful was its balance. It was cheap, hearty, and familiar. In a world where everything else felt foreign, that nutty taste reminded them of home. And when onions caramelized in a pan, the smell turned even the gloomiest New York apartment into something warm. Even today, buckwheat is dirt cheap, less than $5 a bag, and a skillet of kasha with onions could still carry a family through tight times. For immigrants, it wasn't just food, it was proof they could make it, one simple bowl at a time. 2. Potato babka. If there was one dish that turned scraps into something grand, it was potato babka. Immigrants from Poland and Belarus brought this oven-baked loaf with them, and in New York's tenements it became a lifesaver. Grated potatoes, onions, and just a little flour were pressed into pans, then baked until the top crisped and the inside stayed soft and filling. It was food made for survival, cheap, sturdy, and able to stretch across an entire week. Mothers sliced it thick to feed children before school. Fathers wrapped pieces in paper and carried them to factory jobs. On Sundays, if a family had an egg or bit of butter, they'd add it to the batter, turning survival bread into a rare treat. Today, potatoes are still one of the cheapest staples you can buy, about $3 for a 5-pound bag. Potato babka proved that even in the hardest times, you could bake hope into something golden and feed a family with almost nothing. 3. Sour rye. Soup with hard-boiled eggs. For Polish immigrants, nothing tasted more like home than a steaming bowl of sour rye soup, żurek. It started with a simple rye starter left to sour for days in a jar. Add water, garlic, maybe a potato or two, and suddenly you had a pot that could feed a family all week. The tangy, earthy flavor was unlike anything Americans were eating at the time, but to immigrants, it was pure comfort. When money allowed, they'd drop in a hard-boiled egg, sometimes even a scrap of sausage. But most days, the egg alone was the meat of the dish, sliced thin so everyone got a taste. In tenement kitchens, families would huddle around the table, dipping bread into bowls, stretching every drop. In 2025, you can still make żurek for pennies. A bag of rye flour costs under $3, and eggs remain one of the most affordable proteins. For those Ellis Island families, this sour soup wasn't just food, it was survival with soul. 4. Cabbage and barley skillet. In the kitchens of Slavic immigrants, cabbage was king. Cheap, hearty, and always available, it became the backbone of countless survival meals. One of the simplest was a cabbage and barley skillet, just shredded cabbage, a handful of barley, and maybe an onion fried in fat if the family could spare it. Cooked slowly in one pan, it transformed into a dish that could stretch for days. This was peasant food at its purest. Children filled their bowls before trudging off to school, while fathers carried tin cups of it to the shipyards. Mothers often flavored it with nothing more than salt and pepper, yet the nutty barley and sweet cabbage gave it depth far beyond its cost. Even in 2025, barley is still one of the cheapest grains you can buy, about $2 for a bag that lasts weeks. Pair it with cabbage at under $1 a head, and you've got a meal Ellis Island families would instantly recognize: simple, sustaining, and strong enough to carry you through hard times. 5. Herring and beet salad with vinegar dressing. For many Eastern European immigrants, herring wasn't just food, it was memory. In crowded Ellis Island kitchens, salted herring mixed with boiled beets and onions became a salad that stretched far and fed many. The vinegar dressing gave it a sharp bite, balancing the sweetness of the beets and the saltiness of the fish. It wasn't fancy, but it was practical. A single piece of cured herring could flavor an entire bowl, and the vegetables filled everyone's stomach. Families often ate it with black bread, passing plates around crowded tables where nothing was wasted. Children might wrinkle their noses at the strong fish, but it was protein they couldn't afford to refuse. In 2025, this dish still costs next to nothing. Canned or salted herring runs under $3, and beets remain one of the cheapest root vegetables. For immigrant families, this salad wasn't just about taste. It was a reminder that even scraps of fish and humble beets could feel like a feast when survival was on the line. 6. Onion and bread. Dumpling soup. When German and Sudeten immigrants arrived, they carried with them the art of turning scraps into comfort. Nothing showed this better than onion and bread dumpling soup. Day-old bread, too tough to chew, was grated or torn, mixed with egg if one was available, and rolled into dumplings. These were dropped into a pot of onion broth, simmered until tender, and served steaming hot. In the drafty tenements of New York, this dish warmed more than bodies. It warmed spirits. Children loved fishing out the dumplings, while parents knew it stretched a few crusts into a whole meal. On rare nights, a bit of meat drippings or butter would be stirred in, elevating it from survival to luxury. Even today, bread is still among the cheapest foods, and onions cost barely cents each. Together, they can create a soup for under $2 that feeds a family. For immigrants, this humble bowl was proof that with creativity and care, even scraps could taste like home. 7. Buckwheat blini with sour cream and salted fish. For Russian and Ukrainian immigrants, no food carried more pride than a stack of buckwheat blini. These thin pancakes were made from simple batter, buckwheat flour, water, maybe a splash of milk if the family had any. Cooked on cast-iron skillets, they came out nutty and earthy, perfect for layering with whatever was on hand. Most days, that meant a spoonful of sour cream and a scrap of salted fish. Families would slice herring paper thin so everyone got a taste, laying it across the warm blini. Around the table, the smell of frying batter mixed with the tang of brine, and suddenly a cold New York winter felt a little more bearable. Blini weren't just food, they were ritual. They reminded immigrants of Sunday feasts back home, even when served in the bare kitchens of tenements. And in 2025, a bag of buckwheat flour under $5 still makes dozens. For Ellis Island families, each blini was more than a meal. It was a memory flipped golden in a pan. 8. Lentil and garlic stew with black bread. For many immigrants, lentils were the quiet hero of survival. Cheap, filling, and packed with protein, they could turn a bare pot into a week's worth of meals. In Ellis Island kitchens, families simmered lentils slowly with garlic, onions, and whatever scraps of carrot or celery they could find. The result was a thick, hearty stew that clung to the spoon and filled empty bellies. But the real magic came when it was paired with slices of dense black bread. Dipped into the steaming pot, the bread soaked up the rich, garlicky broth, stretching the meal even further. Fathers carried it in tins to factories, while children ate it hot before school, fueling them through long days in crowded classrooms. Even today, lentils cost less than $2 a bag and cook up into a meal that can feed a family for days. For immigrants, this stew was more than food. It was proof that with a few pennies and a little patience, you could survive and even thrive in a new land. 9. Rice and cabbage dolma. For immigrants from the Balkans and the Ottoman lands, stuffed cabbage, dolma, was more than a dish. It was tradition wrapped in leaves. Families would boil whole cabbages until soft, peel back the leaves, and fill them with a mixture of rice, onions, and herbs. Meat was rare in Ellis Island kitchens, so most dolma were strictly vegetarian, yet still bursting with flavor. Rolled tight and simmered in a pot of tomato broth, they became tender little bundles of survival. Around the table, children would fight over the smallest rolls, while mothers took pride in stretching a handful of rice into dozens of servings. Even in cramped apartments, the smell of simmering cabbage and garlic turned dinner into an event. In 2025, rice is still one of the cheapest foods you can buy, just a few dollars for a big bag, and cabbage rarely costs more than $1 a head. For immigrant families, dolma proved that patience and skill could transform simple ingredients into something comforting, filling, and unforgettable. 10. Millet porridge with honey and walnuts. For many Central and Eastern European immigrants, millet was the grain of survival. Before oats and cornmeal took over American kitchens, millet porridge was the daily fuel of the poor. On Ellis Island, families boiled it into a thick, golden mush, sweetened with a drizzle of honey if they could spare it. On special days, a few crushed walnuts were sprinkled on top, turning plain porridge into something that felt almost festive. Children ate it for breakfast before trudging off to school, while tired fathers relied on it after long shifts at the docks. Its nutty flavor and filling weight kept hunger away when nothing else could. Mothers often cooked big pots at night, letting it firm up, then frying slices the next day so nothing went to waste. Even now, millet is still a budget-friendly grain, just a few dollars a bag, and packed with nutrients. For immigrants, a simple bowl of millet with honey wasn't just breakfast. It was comfort, warmth, and a small taste of sweetness in a hard new world. 11. Potato knish. For Jewish immigrants, nothing said home quite like a warm quiche. These hand pies, flaky dough wrapped around mashed potatoes and onions, were the ultimate street food of survival. On the Lower East Side, nishes were sold from pushcarts for just a few cents, hot and ready to eat. For a factory worker on a 10-minute break, one nish could fill the stomach and keep hunger away for hours. At home, mothers rolled dough as thin as paper, stuffed it with potatoes left over from the night before, and baked them until golden. Children clutched them on their way to school, while fathers carried 2 or 3 to the workshop. The beauty of the niche was its portability. You didn't need a plate, just your hands and a little salt. Even today, potatoes and onions remain among the cheapest foods you can buy. For Ellis Island families, a niche wasn't just a snack. It was a lifeline wrapped in dough, warm, filling, and full of memory. 12. Brown bread and molasses pudding, Irish immigrant dessert. For Irish immigrants, dessert didn't mean sugar and cream. It meant survival sweets like brown bread and molasses pudding. Made from stale bread soaked in milk, mixed with blackstrap molasses, and baked until firm, it turned scraps into something warm and filling. The deep, dark sweetness of molasses was a taste many Irish families carried from home, where sugar was too expensive for everyday use. In the crowded kitchens of New York, this pudding was often the only treat children got all week. Mothers served it warm on Sunday nights, cutting it into squares so every hand at the table received a piece. Fathers, worn out from factory work, found comfort in its heavy sweetness, a reminder of Ireland even as they built new lives in America. Molasses was cheap, bread was nearly free, and together they created a dessert that felt like luxury in lean times. For Ellis Island families, this pudding proved that even hardship had room for a little sweetness. 13. Chickpea and carrot stew with paprika. For immigrants from the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, chickpeas were a lifesaver. Cheap, filling, and easy to store, they became the base of countless Ellis Island meals. One favorite was a chickpea and carrot stew, spiced with paprika. Carrots gave it sweetness, chickpeas gave it heft, and paprika, sometimes smoky, sometimes sharp, added a warmth that reminded families of home. Cooked in one pot, it bubbled slowly through the day, filling tenement hallways with a smell that drew in hungry neighbors. Children would dunk bread into the thick broth, while adults ladled it over rice or potatoes to stretch it further. Even without meat, it felt hearty enough to power long days in factories and laundries. In 2025, dried chickpeas still cost only a few dollars a bag, and carrots remain one of the cheapest vegetables around. This stew, born from necessity, proves that with a handful of humble ingredients and a dash of spice, you can create a meal that feeds body and spirit. 14. Old World sauerkraut and mushroom pierogi. For Polish and Ukrainian immigrants, pierogi were more than dumplings. They were comfort wrapped in dough. On Ellis Island, families rolled out thin sheets of flour and water dough, then filled them with sauerkraut and mushrooms. Meat was rare, but cabbage and foraged mushrooms were cheap, and together they gave pierogi a tangy, earthy flavor that felt like home. Mothers gathered children around the table to pinch the dough into half-moon shapes, teaching them the skill with every fold. Pots of boiling water turned the raw pierogi into steaming bundles, often finished in a pan with a little butter or onion, if the family could spare it. Around crowded tables, a single batch might feed 10 hungry mouths. Even in 2025, pierogi are still one of the most affordable meals to make. Flour, cabbage, and mushrooms cost just a few dollars. For Ellis Island families, each bite was more than survival. It was a reminder that even in a strange land, tradition could keep you rooted. 15. Dandelion greens and egg scramble. For many immigrants, survival meant learning to see food where others saw weeds. Dandelion greens, picked from alleys, yards, and empty lots, became a free and vital ingredient. Bitter when raw, but tender when cooked, the greens were sautéed in a pan with garlic or onion, then scrambled with an egg or two if the family could afford them. This simple dish packed both nourishment and resourcefulness. Children were often sent to gather dandelions, returning with baskets of weeds that mothers turned into dinner. Eggs stretched the meal further, feeding entire families for just pennies. For tired workers, that plate of greens and eggs meant strength for the next day. Even today, dandelion greens remain one of the cheapest and healthiest foods, sometimes still free if you know where to look. For Ellis Island families, this humble scramble wasn't just a meal. It was proof that with sharp eyes and a little creativity, you could turn hardship into nourishment. 16. Salt cod and potato fritters. For Portuguese and Azorean immigrants, salt cod, bacalhau, was the taste of both home and survival. Preserved in barrels of salt, it could last for months at sea and arrive ready to cook in New York. Families soaked the stiff fillets in water to soften them, then flaked the fish into mashed potatoes mixed with onion and parsley, and fried them into golden fritters. These little cakes were portable, filling, and perfect for stretching a small piece of fish into a meal for many. Children ate them hot from the pan, while fathers carried a few in their lunch tins to the docks or construction sites. The salty, savory flavor paired with cheap potatoes made it one of the most reliable survival foods in the immigrant kitchen. Even today, salt cod remains affordable and shelf-stable, while potatoes are still among the cheapest staples. For Ellis Island families, these fritters weren't just food, they were resilience, fried crisp and shared in every bite. 17. Stewed apples with hard bread and cinnamon. For many immigrant families, dessert didn't come from bakeries, it came from ingenuity. Stewed apples with hard bread and a pinch of cinnamon was a sweet born of scraps. Bruised apples, often sold cheap at markets, were peeled, sliced, and simmered down with a little sugar or molasses if the family had it. The soft, fragrant fruit was then spooned over chunks of stale bread, letting the juices soak in until the crusts turned tender. Sometimes, a sprinkle of cinnamon transformed the dish from simple to special. Children devoured it warm, while parents savored it as a reminder of orchard harvests back home. It wasn't cake or pie, but it gave comfort at the end of long, exhausting days. Even today, apples remain inexpensive, and day-old bread is often free at bakeries. For Ellis Island families, this humble dessert proved that with a little care, even the bruised and broken could be turned into something sweet enough to lift spirits. 18. Oat and prune. Breakfast cakes. For many immigrants, mornings began with something simple but sustaining: oat and prune breakfast cakes. Rolled oats were cheap, filling, and easy to find in America. Prunes, often sold in bulk, added both sweetness and fiber, making them the perfect partner. Mothers would mash soaked prunes into the oats, form little patties, and fry them on a cast-iron skillet with a touch of fat. The result was a dense, chewy cake that fueled children for school and kept workers going through long shifts. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. Even a small stack could keep hunger away until evening. And when drizzled with a little honey or dusted with sugar, on rare, lucky days, it tasted almost indulgent. In 2025, oats and prunes remain two of the cheapest pantry staples. A bag of oats costs just a couple of dollars, and dried prunes last for months. For Ellis Island families, these cakes weren't just breakfast. They were a reliable start to survival in a new land. 19. Cabbage and dried pea mash. For Scandinavian immigrants, cabbage and peas were the workhorses of survival. Dried peas were cheap, easy to store, and hearty enough to replace meat. Combined with boiled cabbage, they became a rustic mash that was simple, filling, and nourishing. Families would simmer the peas until soft, then stir in shredded cabbage, a little salt, and maybe a drizzle of pork fat if they had it. The mash was thick, humble, and designed to stretch. Children ate it by the bowlful, while fathers carried it in tin containers to the docks and rail yards. Its earthy, sweet flavor wasn't fancy, but it stuck to the ribs and kept hunger at bay. In drafty tenement kitchens, this dish warmed bodies as much as it filled them. Even today, dried peas cost just a few dollars a bag, and cabbage remains one of the cheapest vegetables. For Ellis Island families, cabbage and pea mash was proof that survival didn't need luxury, just patience and a pot. 20. Barley and turnip pottage with parsley oil. For many immigrants from rural Europe, barley and turnips were the taste of survival. Both were cheap, sturdy, and easy to find in American markets. In Ellis Island kitchens, they were simmered together into a thick pottage, a rustic soup that could be ladled out day after day. Barley gave the broth a nutty heft, while turnips added sweetness that softened with cooking. To brighten it, families often stirred in a drizzle of parsley oil, just chopped greens mashed with whatever fat was available. It wasn't luxury, but it lifted the dish with fresh flavor. Around crowded tables, bowls of potage were passed down, steaming and steady, proof that simple ingredients could sustain a family through the hardest days. Even in 2025, barley costs just a few dollars a bag, and turnips remain one of the cheapest root vegetables. For Ellis Island immigrants, this humble potage wasn't about taste alone. It was about making a little grain and a few roots feel like enough. 21. Black bread with rendered goose fat. Spread for Jewish and Eastern European immigrants, black bread was more than food, it was identity. Dense, dark, and sour, it was baked from rye flour and carried from the old world into the crowded bakeries of New York. But what made it a true survival dish was the spread, rendered goose fat. In families that couldn't afford butter, every bit of fat from a rare roasted goose was saved, cooled, and spread thinly across slices of bread. This combination was hearty, filling, and surprisingly rich. Children often got a single slice before school, while fathers tucked it into their lunch tins. Even a smear of goose fat added flavor and energy, turning plain bread into a meal. On special days, onions fried in the fat were added, elevating it into a true treat. Today, black bread still costs just a few dollars a loaf, and fat, though no longer prized, is cheap fuel. For Ellis Island families, this wasn't indulgence. It was survival spread thin, shared wide, and savored. 22. Buckwheat and onion stuffed cabbage. Rolls, stuffed cabbage rolls, known by many names across Eastern Europe, were a comfort dish carried into the kitchens of Ellis Island. Meat was rare, so immigrant families often filled boiled cabbage leaves with a mixture of buckwheat groats, caramelized onions, and a pinch of herbs. Rolled tight and simmered in a pot of tomato broth or plain salted water, they came out soft, savory, and deeply satisfying. Mothers taught their children how to roll the leaves just right, lining them up in rows inside battered pots. Each roll stretched a handful of grain into a full serving, making it a perfect dish for feeding a family of 10 from almost nothing. Around the table, every bite tasted like home, even when eaten in a crowded tenement apartment thousands of miles away. In 2025, buckwheat and cabbage are still some of the cheapest foods in the store. For Ellis Island families, these rolls weren't just dinner, they were a way to wrap hope, tradition, and survival into every bite. 23. Sweet carrot and raisin kugel. For Jewish immigrants, kugel was a dish that brought the Sabbath to life, even in the cramped kitchens of Ellis Island. This version used noodles baked with grated carrots, raisins, and sometimes a touch of cinnamon or sugar if the family could afford it. The carrots gave sweetness, the raisins added bursts of flavor, and the noodles held everything together in a golden, comforting casserole. Kugel wasn't just food, it was memory. Mothers baked it in heavy pans, slicing it into squares to share at the table. Children loved it warm, its sweet aroma filling hallways of crowded tenements, while fathers saw it as a rare treat after a week of long shifts. Even when ingredients were scarce, this dish carried the spirit of celebration into the harsh reality of immigrant life. Today, noodles, carrots, and raisins are still among the cheapest pantry staples. For Ellis Island families, kugel was proof that even in poverty, tradition and sweetness could be baked into survival. 24. Pickled beet and potato salad with horseradish. For Eastern European immigrants, pickled vegetables were essential. Beets and potatoes were inexpensive, hardy, and perfect for storage in small tenement pantries. Combining them into a salad with a sharp horseradish dressing created a dish that was both filling and full of flavor, a rare punch of spice and tang in an otherwise bland survival diet. Families layered slices of boiled potatoes and tender pickled beets, drizzling the mixture with grated horseradish to add bite. Even children, initially wary of the strong flavor, learned to love it, and fathers carried portions to work for a midday meal. This salad could last days in a cool corner, making it ideal for families who needed both nutrition and economy. Today, beets, potatoes, and horseradish remain inexpensive. For Ellis Island immigrants, this salad wasn't just a side, it was ingenuity on a plate. With simple ingredients, they created meals that nourished both body and spirit, proving that even in hardship, flavor and survival could coexist. 25. Dried fruit and nut compote with honey. For immigrants across Europe, dried fruit and nuts were treasures of survival. On Ellis Island, families combined whatever they could afford, prunes, raisins, walnuts, almonds, with a drizzle of honey to create a compote that was both sweet and nourishing. It wasn't an everyday dish. It was reserved for Sundays, holidays, or when there was just enough to make a treat. Mothers chopped, stirred, and simmered the mixture gently, letting the flavors meld into a sticky, fragrant pudding. Children's eyes lit up at the smell, and fathers savored spoonfuls as a rare indulgence after long days at the docks or factories. Every bite carried warmth, energy, and a memory of home, proof that sweetness could survive even in hardship. Even today, dried fruit and nuts are still affordable, and a little honey transforms them into a treat. For Ellis Island families, this compote wasn't just dessert. It was a symbol of resilience, creativity, and the ability to find joy in small things, no matter how difficult life became. Looking back at these 25 recipes, one thing becomes clear. Survival wasn't just about money or luck. It was about creativity, resilience, and heart. From buckwheat kasha to dried fruit compote, every dish tells a story of families who arrived with nothing but hope, tradition, and the skills to turn scraps into meals. These weren't fancy dishes. They were humble, practical, and deeply rooted in culture. Yet, in every bite, there's a lesson for today. Resourcefulness can turn scarcity into sustenance, and even the simplest ingredients can carry comfort, memory, and joy. Walking through history one dish at a time, you realize that food is more than fuel. It's identity, survival, and connection all at once.